warriors.
There were few professionals in armies of this time. Most men on the battlefield had no choice but to be there. But some noblemen did have a retinue of paid fighting men, singled out from an early age to wear their livery. Was number 16 part of such a fighting elite?
If he were in a livery, and I can see him in my mind, he must have been an individual that would have been a livery soldier. I think he appears to have been training from a very young age, before he was physiologically mature. And what I mean by that is sometime prior to the age of, say, 14, 15, he would have been already training. In addition to that, he's a very broad individual, which may suggest either one, he's that way because of this activity, or probably because he was selected because he's a broad individual.
Trusted retainers or not, number 16 and his comrades were experienced in battle. But even for them, Towton was a new horror. Both sides were ordered to show no mercy. So great was the slaughter of men, say the chronicles, that the very carcasses hindered them that fought. The figure of 28,000 dead, counted by the heralds, started to circulate within a matter of weeks. Today it's a death toll that invites both disbelief and horror.
I think 28,000 dead is a totally implausible number. I mean, if you accept that, then it's rather like accepting that more men died at Towton than did in the disastrous first day of the Somme on the 1st of July 1916, advancing against machine guns in open field.
So what evidence does the grave pit give the archaeologists for the ferocity of the killing? Shannon Novak, more familiar with gunshots than sword cuts, is working out how to identify which weapons produced the wound marks found in the skeletons.
To me, this really looks like a blunt instrument with a specific shape that's come in very hard and fast and then be retracted.
I mean, you've either got something like this, the Warhammer.
The Warhammer.
This one is flattened diamond section, as we know from profiling.
Let's look at that again. Do you have, should we
Let's just
turn
do
it
it,
and give you a clean?
do that one. So there we go. That's very square. Now if you imagine he's upright and I'm upright and I swing with that.
Yeah.
So something swinging in and smashing through.
And you could deliver a good force of that.
Yes.
From the weapon profile she developed, Shannon found the most common cause of death was a blade wound from either sword, dagger or battle axe. More stabbing wounds came from the spike of a pole axe or a horseman's hammer, with the victims apparently on the ground. She found only one arrow wound. Beyond doubt, number 16 and his companions were killed at close quarters. But the wound patterns showed something curious. Almost without exception, the men were killed with blows directly to the head, and it appears they were completely unprotected.
This is what puzzles me.
One individual has
all got head wounds.
Head wounds, multiple head wounds.
The one thing you are not going to leave out from going into battle at this period is a helmet, because you know, a lot of injuries are going to be received on the head. So again, we're back to this problem where lots of these men don't seem to have been wearing helmets.
Without helmets and with the death blows targeting the head and face, it was almost as if these men had been singled out for punishment.
They died from a blow, probably delivered at arm's length, and then after that, their fate was sort of sealed even further by delivering similar blows to the head region. My own feeling is that some of these individuals may have actually still been living when they received the second and tertiary and subsequent blows, but obviously The primary injury would have caused them to perhaps be less able to defend themselves. And they're just being mutilated. Essentially, it's a massacre.
The idea of a massacre upsets all conventional notions about the age of chivalry. We imagine battles were conducted according to a code of honor. If so, it was a code from which most at Towton were excluded.
We have an image in our mind of the knight in shining armour galloping across the countryside, rescuing damsels in distress. Something else is the idea of courtesy to other knights, and particularly granting mercy to a vanquished opponent. It was an aristocratic ideal. It only extended to other knights. I think they had no compunction at all in mistreating anyone who was not a knight.
What that mistreatment might involve was becoming apparent in the laboratory. Some of the wounds around the time of death were unusual and disturbing. Skulls showed repeated shallow cuts to the ears, the scalp, and face. They raised a grisly possibility.
In this case, we have at least one individual that seems to have had his nose targeted. Also, there's some scratches above the ear, I think on the left side in one individual, a series of parallel scratches. They're in size, so it's not a chopping, it's kind of a cutting, which may suggest that an ear, or for some reason a part of the ear and scalp, was removed. And that, again, may suggest that we're dealing with a case of mutilation.
The suspicions about mutilation and mistreatment had been strengthened by the position in the grave of another skeleton, number 24. Uncovering his remains, the team had found both arms twisted behind him. For them, the conclusion appeared inescapable.
When we came across the skeleton, who appeared to have his arms behind his back, which is obviously a very unnatural position, we thought he might have been a prisoner or something, with his arms tied behind his back, and his legs were touching at the knees as well, which was quite unusual as well. So we thought this might be a very important skeleton in the analysis.
Different scenarios run through your mind at the time. One would assume that he would have been captured. Somebody would have had to have tied his arms behind his back. And there is the idea that this individual may have been tortured, may have been suffered before he died of his injuries.
For the archaeologists, a possible hypothesis was taking shape. Lined up by the grave pit, stripped, mutilated, executed. It's a scenario all too familiar to our own century, but still sits uncomfortably with the so-called age of chivalry. This veteran soldier had fought many battles. Did his last one really end with him and his comrades being put to death as prisoners? After 500 years, the battlefield of Towton is not about to surrender its secrets easily. We know the soldiers in the grave pit were killed with multiple blows to the head. Some of them had been mutilated at the point of death. It looked like an execution. The archaeologists had even determined that the victims' hands were tied. Or so they thought. Shannon Novak's work on the wounds was starting to suggest that number 16 and his companions might not have died quietly.
At some point, these individuals had arms and hands free to defend themselves. Most of the wounds that occur in the body are in the arms and the hands, and these are classic defense wounds. For example, in homicides with stabbings, you'll often see individuals with extensive cuts to their hands, down to the bone, because they'll often grab the blade. And what we're seeing at Towton are reminiscent of defense wounds, which says to me their hands weren't bound.
Tim Sutherland was independently coming to the same conclusion. During the original excavation, skeleton number 24 had appeared to be lying with his arms behind him. The assumption was that his hands were tied in that position. But at the bottom of the grave pit, the archaeologists made a bizarre discovery. A single severed arm, quite separate from any body. At first they thought it was an amputation, but back in the laboratory, Tim Sutherland set to work with his 3D image of the grave to put the bodies back together. What he found was that the new arm actually belonged with skeleton 24.
We emptied the grave completely, and at the very bottom there appeared to be a spare arm. The result of the investigation into the computer work meant that we could analyse each individual skeleton in an attempt to match the spare arm up with one of the bodies. And what actually happened was that skeleton number 24 superimposed exactly over the spare arm.
In the scramble of the original dig, skeleton 24 had been allocated the arm of his neighbour in the grave, giving the impression that he had both arms behind him. The 3D image now showed that his hands couldn't have been tied. The grave pit warriors may not have been helpless victims at all. As number 16 was moulded back to life, the question marks over his death were reappearing.
You can see where the wounds that killed him would have gone now as well. So,
Yes.
so that first wound there would have gone through his eye, and the second one down the side of his nose and went through the mouth.
How was it that this old soldier had come to die? At which point in the battle did he receive the blows that finished him off?
And then smack down there. Really
Right down the side.
quite uncompromising, wasn't it?
Mm.
Quite uncompromising.
Few people have a better overview of the Towton battlefield than Simon Richardson. Archaeologists and metal detectors make a strange alliance, but Simon brings a unique perspective to the work of the Bradford team. He's been searching the battlefield in all weathers for 16 years.
Do imagine what it would have been like, what the people were like. You think about the injuries the men would have received and probably the screams, the men crying. You know, it must have been pretty horrendous. When I started out, I expected to find battle axes and swords, breastplates and helmets, but it turned out quite different from what I expected.
Simon's finds from the battlefield are small but telling in their personal detail. A signet ring, a buckle from harness or armour, the tip of a scabbard, a broken spur. These are not the glorious booty of war, but the fallout from hand-to-hand fighting, abandoned or lost in flight or death.
It feels quite personal really when I find the artefacts. Think of the last person to wear it. Did they actually die? Or was it pulled off and they managed to escape?
Unusually, Simon plots the position of every object he discovers and shares his data with the archaeologists to build a picture of the fighting's ebb and flow.